don't know about you, but I'm having flashbacks to college days and high school days. Of course, we had chalkboards back then, not whiteboards. Let's talk about the actual so-called exposure triangle digital photography. We're not talking about film here. ISO has no connection to exposure in digital photography. ISO is applied after the exposure has already occurred. Now, I was trying to think of about a near-perfect analogy so that people could understand. Obviously, too, you may be limited, depending on what you're shooting, on your ISO settings. If it is sports or action and your shutter speed is a priority, or you're shooting in shutter priority, then you obviously have limited set ISO that you can do. Or if it is the case that you want either a really small aperture or rather large aperture for a shallow depth of field, obviously then you're also limited. This is why lighting control is so incredibly important. The more control you have, the better latitude you have in making the composition that you want. But let's make an analogy that I think everybody would understand. And I don't drink, but I thought, well, what better perfect analogy, since most people drink, even though I don't, than an alcohol analogy. Or we could even talk about Starbucks. You know how when you get a Starbucks, they basically fill it up with that much coffee and the rest of it's ice? Because when you buy a Starbucks, it's always filled like right up there to the top. When you go and get that burnt coffee that costs too much. So right here is the level we want to reach, right, for ETTR. Exposing to the right, or sensor saturation. Potency equals not efficiency, but saturation. Saturation. So let's do a comparison between low ISO and high ISO. Every time you get an expensive, burnt-tasting coffee, and I'm not going to name the brand, but you can guess which one, I fill it up with about that much coffee, right? This would be ISO 1000, because coffee, as it turns out, is a lot more expensive than water. So you stick in about this much liquor. I'm going to use a liquor analogy. Except liquor also has the same L as light. Okay? So this is actually how much light we have in both glasses. High ISO, this is actually how much light we have, and the rest is filled with water. And that water is ISO. ISO is applied gain. ISO is not part of exposure. ISO is applied after exposure occurs, past tense. The reason why you want to shoot the lowest possible ISO, and you obviously may not have the latitude to, given the exposure and the composition that you're looking for, because you may want, some oddball aperture or some oddball shutter speed to make the shot come out, make it look the way you want. You want to shoot the lowest possible ISO, because here we have the light, or here we have the liquor, right? And right up here is where we add the water, or the ISO. Here we have this, and water is noise. Okay, ISO is noise. Now, SNR firmware and signal processing has gotten extremely good in recent cameras. We could actually shoot really clean images with a little noise reduction application applied, either like in Topaz Elements or denoise projects or whatever sort of denoising post-production you want to do to the shot that you've taken, but it's still noise. The cleanest, best saturation you got is the lowest possible ISO. Now we actually have three aspects of the actual exposure triangle. Two, everybody knows, still applicable since the days of film. One, obviously, is aperture or gain, and the other is shutter or time. Obviously, the two of these are adjustable. That's what the ADJ stands for. The exposure triangle. The third aspect in digital photography, we're not talking about film, is SNR, signal to noise ratio. However, instead of calling it signal to noise, which is what it stands for, it should be called signal over noise. The least amount of noise, the greatest amount of signal. There's no difference between radio theory and antenna theory than there is in digital photography. We actually have four aspects of SNR. Now the question is, and I had a few people try to get into a debate with me over the past few days, well, SNR is not adjustable, but ISO is. You have a dial for setting your ISO. Well, this is certainly true. And setting your ISO gives you the latitude to make your aperture or your shutter be whatever you would like it to be, such that the composition manifests, so that it's sharp, so that you actually have the depth of field you do or do not want, whatever, depending on the composition. But ISO, even though it has a dial, is not part of exposure, but it does give you that latitude, obviously, to adjust gain and time, shutter speed and aperture. But I've been told incorrectly that, well, SNR is native on the sensor, which is one aspect of signal-to-noise ratio. But SNR, signal-to-noise ratio, is as adjustable as is the amount of coffee you stick in that, when you go to you see the only thing that actually costs money is the coffee. The rest of it's filled up with water. So you do have, what sort of adjustment do we actually have on these 4 different aspects? Do we have adjustment with lens? We have 4 different aspects of signal to noise ratio. The third leg, or the top tier of the triangle, of the exposure triangle of digital photography. Let's talk about number 1. Is it adjustable? The answer is yes, it is adjustable. How adjustable is it in the relative system? Well, it goes from, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's about a 4, but it's really important, so it is adjustable. Like a low efficiency lens, like a 30 element count zoom lens versus a 5 or 6 element dreamy 85 millimeter f1.4, for example, where the inner tonal details that actually add to the micro contrast are what specifically should be called image fidelity. So yes, it is adjustable. Obviously, this is part of the je ne sais quoi, or the actual character of the lens. Everybody loves to talk about how sharp a lens is, what's its t-stop, what's its f-stop. However, photographers don't really talk about t-stops, so they should talk about t-stops. Cinematographers talk about t-stops all the time. Photographers are wondering about, oh my god, how fast of a lens can I get? f/0.95. You can actually get them faster than that, but really fast. We're not talking about that. It could be an f/0.95. There's a couple, more than a couple actually, really, really fast lenses out there that actually have poor SNR. In other words, they're actual low gain intertonal detail that actually add to, especially and very important for black and white photography, is bad. So they have a high t-stop and they have a huge aperture. It could be like an f1 lens or an f/0.95. It's like the perfect example is a Zeiss Otis. Insanely sharp. A couple of them are very, very fast, but their intertonal transmission SNR is bad. There's a perfect example of a fast lens, insanely sharp, but is just not so hot for black and white photography. Of course, someone will protest to me that a Zeiss Otis is really good for black and white photography, to which my answer is, compared to what? That's my favorite answer. Compared to what? In the broad spectrum of absolutely incredible jaw-dropping, crotch-melting lenses, some of which made by Leica, Contax, Voigtlander, Nikkor lenses, the Zeiss Otis lenses, they're extremely overcorrected, they're extremely high element count. But anyway, the lens is adjustable. Okay? This one, aspect number 2 of SNR, is not adjustable. This is actually made at the factory. This would be the eyeballs of the sensor. Also, too, it's not just the eyeballs or the photosite or the pixel pitch of the sensor of the camera. It's also the micro lens array and the actual efficiency too. There's actually 3 primary aspects of the SNR on the sensor. One is a pixel pitch. Okay, pixel pitch. Other one is micro lens. I can't write there. Micro lens array. And the other one is type. In other words, the type of sensor it is, like BSI sensor versus conventional sensor. Some of the new RGBW sensors are going to be coming out sometime in the future. Some of the new adaptive resistance sensor technology that's been patented by Panasonic. But ultimately have 3 aspects which cannot be adjusted by you, but which are set at factory. This is the native SNR. Because we could have like an old camera like a Nikon D3, which actually has absolutely huge photosites or eyeballs on it. Yet its SNR is not that good. The Nikon D3, as wonderful as it is, and even though the fact that it has huge, huge photosites, does not have very good low light SNR. Okay? Aspect number 3, and this is mainboard SNR firmware algorithms that are actually not upgradable, that are actually on the main board of the digital camera, and this is efficiency. Now, there's a few ways to adjust efficiency. Obviously, the lower the ISO, the better efficiency that you have. Well, I thought ISO is not connected to exposure. It's not, but by lowering the ISO as low as you could possibly take it and yet still get the composition that you want, then you have, of course, the best saturation, you have the best potency. Obviously so. So efficiency is possible, not merely through low ISO lowest ISO setting possible, but there's also dynamic range 100, 200, 300, 400% like on Fujifilm. There's some other minor adjustments where you can actually change efficiency. So is efficiency, that's what EF is for here since I ran out of space. Efficiency adjustable? Only partially. Only partially, only a little bit. And adjusting the ISO doesn't adjust efficiency. What that does is give you better sensor saturation. Because the more you actually raise the ISO, it's no different than, you ordering a Starbucks coffee or going to, I don't know, a cheap bar where they... And of course, that's what bars do. Even though I don't go to bars, and even though I don't like alcohol, the way they make their money is sticking in as little bit of alcohol as possible and filling the rest of it up with water. Okay, so you can actually have better potency, better saturation, low ISO by having the most amount of light in there. Of course, this is the case of our liquor analogy. So, number 3 is only very slightly adjustable. Number 2 is not adjustable at all. Number 1 is adjustable, but ultimate potency between worst to best is not that extreme. Number 4 is where SNR becomes really, really adjustable. Like in the extremely adjustable. Here we have light. We have 2 different types of light. Doesn't matter if it's a speed light or a studio strobe. This is a xenon tube burst. We actually have ambient lighting, and we actually have a xenon tube burst from either a speed light or a studio strobe. So you have ambient and artificial lighting. This is extremely adjustable. I said in a video a few days ago, the people that actually wanted to argue with me or argue with others, that micro contrast, or what should be correctly called image fidelity, doesn't exist. These are the exact same fools. I said, well, okay, unless you think micro contrast doesn't exist, let me ask you about flash pop. It's like so-and-so famous photographer, all he does is flash photography, his models, his peeps, his interiors, use studio strobes to illuminate the interior. So what about those? Those images pop, don't they? Oh my God, yeah, they do. So, well, that image fidelity you're talking about is due to incredible, near instantaneous saturation from a speedlight or studio strobe. By the way, the average speedlight pulse burst is about 1/13,000th of a second. So SNR is adjustable. Of the 4 different aspects that it has, number 1 is totally adjustable depending on the lens that you actually choose. Okay, now it's not going to let in a bunch more light. It's not like when you use a, let's say, an f2.8 lens with a bazillion elements in it versus an f2.8 lens, a prime, with like 5 elements in it. You have the same aperture, both f2.8. The t-stop is relatively the same, but it's the low-gain intertonal details that give you superior SNR. That low-gain intertonal detail is actually the aspect, the part and parcel, the alpha and the omega, the first and the last, if you will, of the micro contrast of the image fidelity that makes black and white images pop, also makes color images pop. It actually gives that 3D absolutely amazing effect, and people just can't put their finger on it. But what it is low gain intertonal detail. So it's totally adjustable. Number 2 is not adjustable at all, and that has 3 aspects: pixel pitch, micro lens array, and efficiency. I think I've seen like 30 or 40 different patents for different types of micro lenses. They're literally lenses that sit over top of the photosites, and also the type of sensor and its efficiency, be it conventional sensor or BSI sensor. Number 3 is efficiency, only very partially adjustable. Obviously the lowest possible ISO setting. Some of the dynamic range settings in your camera between 100 and 400% actually let you adjust the efficiency. Most of the efficiency is not adjustable, like the hardcore, the actual SNR firmware that's on the main board, because noise actually has known set frequencies which can be dialed out through image processing on the main board. Most people forget that a digital camera is not a sensor. That takes images directly from the sensor to your SD cards. It's actually an image processing engine, basically a computer. I mean, anybody that thinks a digital camera is anything other than a computer is a fool. And of course, number 4 is where basically, of the totality, if we actually took aspect 1, 2, 3, and 4 together, and we said that this comprises 100% of SNR, which it does, here we're looking about 10%, but this 10% accounts for 100%, well, not 100%, it accounts for much of low-gain intertonal detail. However, you can actually offset that with a lot of artificial lighting, be it speedlight or studio strobe. At about 10%, 10 or 15%, actually it's about 20%. And the lion's share, 70% plus, is from lighting. ambient versus artificial lighting, but lighting altogether collectively. But when you have control over your lighting, then you really got complete and total control. So, well, if I do complete and total sensor saturation, do ETTR with ambient lighting versus artificial lighting, it's ultimately the same. The answer to that is no. Even in the brightest sunlight, exposing all the way to the point where you do have clipping, near clipping anyway, on your highlights, ambient still doesn't even come within an arm's length of artificial lighting. There's nothing on this earth for photography that's come even close to pop from, of course, back before we had xenon tubes, we actually had flash bulbs. And of course, those are even before the days, those are days even before my time. But nevertheless, instantaneous, near instantaneous burst of light from artificial illumination. So the actual exposure triangle is comprised of three things: gain and aperture, time or shutter, and SNR. And SNR is adjustable depending on which of the four aspects of SNR we're talking about. Now here's a question. This will always confuse people. When does time become basically irrelevant? When you have basically no ambient illumination and everything you have is artificial illumination and it's really dark, your ambient illumination is nearly non-existent. When does time, this will stump people, when does time become irrelevant? When the exposure triangle, for flash photography in gritty low light situations where you're whipping out the speed light, or your ambient illumination in your lighting ratio totality of composition is like 10% or less. In other words, you can see enough to take the shot, but all your lighting is going to be artificial. In the exposure triangle of digital photography, time becomes irrelevant because it doesn't matter if your shutter speed is 1/2 of a second or 1/1000th of a second. It doesn't make any difference because the average speed light burst, say you're doing, some sort of subject photography at 15 feet or less. Your average speed light burst is 1/13,000th of a second, which is a extremely brief period of time. And both these shots, given extremely low or near non-existent ambient illumination, will be identical, and time becomes irrelevant. Instead of the exposure triangle, it would become what? Well, I say a triangle. It would become the exposure line. You'd actually have only two things where you basically have nearly all flash photography. You only have two, and this is the reason why light meters tell you to adjust your aperture, not your shutter speed. You feel me? You only have two aspects of exposure in digital photography. You have gain, i.e. aperture, and you have SNR. There's only two. Shutter speed or time becomes basically irrelevant at the ambient lighting at 10% or less of the total composition. Remember, ISO occurs after the exposure has already occurred in digital photography. The exposure has happened. ISO is applied gain. ISO is not part of the exposure triangle. And if you're doing low light flash photography, time becomes essentially irrelevant. Essentially, because everything occurs basically at less than 1/10,000th the average speed light. Average speed light at quarter power, depends on the speed light, about 1/13,000th of a second. Time becomes irrelevant, so it doesn't matter if your shutter speed is 1/2 a second or 1/1000th of a second. This, of course, is where you can start playing with front curtain sync and rear curtain sync, and you just have enough illumination to get trails and movement, but SNR is the most important. Everybody knows about aperture and shutter speed, but in digital photography, I keep seeing people say, well, ISO is part. There's a knob on basically every camera. If there's not a knob, there's a dial. There's something, right? Because everybody knows ISO is part of the exposure triangle. ISO is only part of the exposure triangle in film photography, where actual ISO or ASA is the actual film granulation, the silver halide crystals and their size on the frame of the negative, be it medium format, large format, or 35 millimeter. But in digital photography, the Lord that replaces ISO is this. And the reason why primarily I'm making this video is because there's not a single other person out there in YouTube talking about photography at all that has ever mentioned this. I'll talk about exposure. There's probably 1,000 videos on YouTube about exposure. And of course, they're all talking about digital photography, but not a single one of them has the brains or the wherewithal to realize that the third aspect of the exposure triangle is SNR, which should be, I mean, signal to noise ratio, but proper connotation in your head versus denotation. This is a denotation, signal to noise, and this is connotation for accuracy of understanding. Signal over noise. You know, kind of like when you're driving in your car. Nobody listens to the radio anymore. Like the radio station is pretty far away and you're trying to listen to Whitney Houston and the radio station's getting further and further away and Whitney Houston starts sounding like a crusty old chick with Alzheimer's. It's because the noise is dominating the signal. See? The same thing applies in digital photography. You don't want, you know, like, well, I got noise and you want to go for the maximum amount of signal. You want the signal to completely dominate the noise. Kind of like a Jackass movie I saw where this 600-pound fat lady came in and did a belly flop on a little person. A lot of people will crank up their ISO, and the ISO, people will actually have the noise as the 600-pound fat woman dominating the little person, which is the signal. It's like, no. You want the 600-pound chick that belly flops on the little person. You want that big person to be the signal and the little person to be the noise. Okay, photography looks much better that way. Not only does it look a lot better that way, it's easier to do post-production, be it Lightroom or Capture One. And interestingly enough, when you have the most signal possible without clipping your highlights, then your image fidelity goes BAM! Right through the roof. And the micro contrast. This is where it's really important. This is why this is really important right here. Okay? You could have like all the lighting in the world, which will overcome like a high element count, low efficiency lens. But you still want to have this lens that is a silk, sex, and sugar. Because, girlfriend, there are a lot of lenses out there, thousands of them. And life is too short to buy crap lenses. So just remember, this is the real exposure triangle digital photography. Gain in time and SNR. No ifs, ands, or buts. Peace out, Girl Scout. If you like these videos, you can always drop a small donation. Because I don't sell anything, and I don't have an affiliate link, and I'm not selling hats, and I'm not shilling, and like the rest of these YouTube used car salesmen. Do you feel me? Do you feel me? I think you do. Thank you so much for watching. До свидания, hasta luego, увидимся, aloha, and good night.